The first disappearance happened on a specific November afternoon, and it happened to a man who should have been the safest person in those woods. Middie Rivers had lived in southwestern Vermont his entire life. He was 74 years old when he walked into the forest on November 12, 1945, and he knew the terrain around Glastonbury Mountain the way most people know their own backyard. He was not a tourist. He was not a hiker who had taken a wrong turn. He was a hunting guide, an experienced outdoorsman who had spent decades navigating the ridges and hollows of the Green Mountain National Forest. And yet he vanished 4 miles from his camp, in an area now known as Bickford Hollow, just north of Vermont Route 9 near Woodford. That contradiction is where this story begins. The term Bennington Triangle did not exist yet. It would not be coined for decades by a Vermont author named Joseph A. Citro, describing a stretch of land in southwestern Vermont where multiple people disappeared between 1945 and 1950. But on that November afternoon, there was no legend. There was only a hunting party heading back to camp as the late autumn light began to fail. Rivers was leading the group. Some accounts say he was with his son-in-law, and the two separated for what was supposed to be just a few minutes. Other accounts describe him walking ahead of a party of 4 hunters near Glastonbury Mountain, moving with the confidence of a man who had made this walk 100 times before. The details are not fully consistent, and that tension matters. What is known is that at some point Rivers got ahead of the others and disappeared from view. There was no shout, no sound of a struggle, no reason for alarm, not at first. Because when the man leading you through the woods knows those woods better than anyone, you assume he knows exactly where he is going. It took time for the alarm to be raised. That delay is one of the quiet complications of the case. The group did not panic immediately. They assumed he had circled back. They assumed he had taken a different route. They assumed he knew what he was doing, because he always had. But as the afternoon turned to dusk, and dusk turned to darkness, the assumption began to crack. Here is the detail that investigators keep coming back to. Rivers was a guide. Guides do not get lost. Guides do not wander off the trail without leaving a sign, and guides certainly do not vanish within 4 miles of their own camp, in the middle of a hunting season, on a route they had walked for years. When the search began, it was massive in scale. More than 300 volunteers joined the effort. United States Army soldiers from Fort Devens, Massachusetts, were deployed to comb the area. They searched for 8 days. 8 days of men walking shoulder to shoulder through the dense Vermont forest, scanning the ground for any trace of the missing guide. They found one thing: a single rifle cartridge, matching the caliber Rivers had been carrying that day. There was no blood, no torn clothing, no sign of an animal attack, no indication that he had fallen or been injured, or left the trail for any reason at all. Just a cartridge on the forest floor, lying where it could have been dropped, or placed, or left behind, as the only clue in a mystery that would never be solved. And that is the problem. That single cartridge is the only physical trace. If you want to stay on this case, the next disappearance is already on the timeline. In the comments, write cartridge if you think that piece of evidence holds more weight than it seems. In most wilderness disappearances, there is a trajectory. Someone gets lost, and searchers find footprints, a dropped item, a broken branch, a body. Even in the worst cases, there is usually something that tells the story of what happened. Here, there is nothing. The experienced guide who led others through these woods was never found. His body never surfaced. No hunter stumbled upon his remains in the years that followed. No hiker found bones in a ravine. He simply walked ahead of his group and ceased to exist in any way that could be documented. This is where the investigation takes a turn that most people never hear about. Because once the initial search failed, the questions shifted. They stopped asking where Middie Rivers went and started asking what could make a man disappear so completely that even 1,000 searchers could not find him. The theories began to form, and none of them fit comfortably. These theories each leave something unexplained. If you are following this file, you know the case does not close easily. Stay on this case as we examine the next disappearance that followed. In the comments, write "The file stays open." if you think these cases are connected by something deeper than coincidence. The simplest explanation is that Rivers fell. The terrain near Bickford Hollow is uneven, with hidden ravines and dense undergrowth. A man of 74 could have stumbled, struck his head, and been concealed by the forest in a way that searchers missed. It happens. Bodies have been found years later, only yards from where search parties walked. But here's the complication. Rivers was not a frail man. He was described as sturdy for his age, experienced in the woods, physically capable, and the area where he vanished was searched methodically for 8 days by hundreds of trained volunteers and soldiers. If there was a body within that radius, it is difficult to explain why it was never found. Another theory involves wildlife. Black bears are present in the Green Mountains, and a fatal encounter is possible, though extremely rare. But a bear attack leaves evidence. Blood, disturbed ground, signs of a struggle. None of that was present. A more unsettling possibility is that Rivers was taken, not by an animal, by a person. The idea that he was abducted while hunting alone or after separating from the group has been raised by some researchers. But again, the evidence is absent. There were no witnesses, no motive, no indication that anyone else was in the area that afternoon. And then there's the territory itself. The region extending from downtown Bennington into the Green Mountain National Forest and toward Glastonbury Mountain has a peculiar history. Before the disappearances, there were reports of strange lights, unusual sounds, and a general sense among some locals that the forest did not behave the way forests should. This is not a claim that can be substantiated. It belongs to the realm of folklore and local memory. But it is worth noting that the Bennington Triangle was not named after Rivers alone. 4 more people would vanish from the same area over the next 5 years, including a young woman named Paula Weldon, who disappeared while hiking the Long Trail in 1946, barely a year after Rivers was lost. When a pattern emerges in a single location, the natural question is whether the place itself is the variable. The investigation never produced a definitive answer. No body, no confession, no theory strong enough to close the case. The files remain open. The questions remain unanswered. And the man who knew those woods better than anyone remains somewhere in them, or not in them, and no one can say which. What happened to Middie Rivers on that November afternoon is a question without a satisfying answer. The search was thorough, the effort was real. The only tangible piece of evidence, a single rifle cartridge, tells us almost nothing. But here is what the case asks us to consider. If a man who spent his entire life in the Vermont woods could walk 4 miles ahead of a hunting party and never be seen again, then what does that say about how well we really know the places we think we understand? The Bennington Triangle is not a supernatural claim. It is a name given to a stretch of land where 5 people disappeared in 5 years, and where the first of them was the one least likely to get lost. That is the detail that refuses to settle. That is the reason the case still has not closed. And there is more. Because the disappearances did not stop with Rivers. The next one happened only months later, in a different part of the same forest, involving a different person with a different story, and the pattern that connects them, if there is a pattern, only becomes visible when you look at all 5 cases together. That will be the subject of the next investigation. For now, the trail ends where it began. Bickford Hollow, November 12, 1945. A 74-year-old guide steps ahead of his group and disappears into the late autumn light. The forest does not give him back. The search does not find him. The case never closes. And somewhere in the Green Mountains, maybe, the answer is still waiting. The timeline itself contains a detail that is rarely mentioned, but it matters. Rivers disappeared on November 12th. The massive search involving over 300 volunteers and soldiers from Fort Devens did not begin immediately. There was a lag. Hours that passed between the moment he was noticed missing and the moment organized search efforts began. By the time the first systematic grid searches were underway, the sun had already set on that first night. November nights in the Vermont mountains drop below freezing. If Rivers had been injured, if he had fallen and could not move, those hours were critical, and they were lost. This delay is documented in multiple accounts, though the precise length varies. What is consistent is that the hunting party did not immediately understand the gravity of what had happened. They searched among themselves first, calling his name, checking the camp, assuming he would appear. By the time they reached authorities, the window had narrowed. It is one of those small structural failures that haunt a case. Not negligence, just the ordinary human refusal to believe that something catastrophic has occurred until the evidence becomes undeniable. By the time the evidence was undeniable, the trail had already gone cold. The search itself was conducted with the methods of 1945. There were no helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, no search dogs trained to track human scent across miles of forest, no GPS coordinates to mark searched areas. The volunteers walked in lines, covering the ground on foot, relying on their eyes and their knowledge of the terrain. They were thorough by the standards of the time, but the forest near Glastonbury Mountain is not forgiving. It is dense with hemlock and birch, undercut with ravines, dotted with abandoned logging roads that lead nowhere. A man could lie 10 feet off a trail and be invisible. There is a particular tragedy in the scale of that search. Hundreds of people walked through those woods, looking for a man who had guided many of them through the same terrain. The people searching were not strangers. They were neighbors, fellow hunters, men who had hunted alongside rivers for years, and they did not find him. The single rifle cartridge is the only object ever recovered. It sits in the case file as a piece of evidence that raises more questions than it answers. Was it fired? The sources do not say. Was it ejected from the rifle during a moment of distress, or dropped accidentally while Rivers was walking? Was it placed there, deliberately or not, by someone involved in his disappearance? There is no forensic analysis that has been publicly shared, no ballistics report that clarifies the scene. The cartridge is a trace, a sign that Rivers was present at that spot, but it tells nothing about what happened next. And that is the pattern of this case. Every piece of information that surfaces leads to another wall. Consider the two inconsistent accounts of the hunting party itself. One version describes Rivers leading a group of 4 hunters near Glastonbury Mountain. He walked ahead, as he often did, and the others assumed they would catch up. When they reached the next landmark, he was not there. They waited. They called. He did not answer. The other version places Rivers alone with his son-in-law. The two men separated for what was meant to be a brief interval, minutes, not hours. When the son-in-law returned to the meeting point, Rivers was gone. These two accounts are not compatible. If there were 4 other hunters, they would have noticed a man disappearing from a group. If there was only one other person, the dynamics of the separation change entirely. Which version is accurate? The sources do not agree. The Vermont Daily Chronicle piece mentions the group of 4. The Lethbridge News Now article specifies the son-in-law. Both are journalistic accounts written long after the fact, drawing on interviews and archives that may themselves have been inconsistent. This is not a failing of the reporting. It is a feature of a case where the primary witnesses, the people who were actually there, left conflicting memories, or did not speak publicly, or told different stories at different times. And the case file, if it still exists in its entirety, has not been made fully public. That opacity is another layer of the mystery. There is no central repository of all evidence from the Rivers disappearance. No digitized archive where a researcher can compare witness statements, search logs, and forensic findings. The records are scattered across local historical societies, newspaper archives, and private collections. The result is that anyone who studies this case today is working with fragments. The Wikipedia entry gives the basic facts. The Vermont Public Podcast from March of 2025 confirms the timeline and the broader context of the 5 disappearances. The Vermont Daily Chronicle and Lethbridge News Now articles each contribute details that partially overlap and partially diverge. But no single source contains the complete picture. This is where the Bennington Triangle itself becomes a complicating factor. The term was popularized by Joseph A. Citro, a Vermont author who wrote about the cluster of disappearances and gave them a name that evoked the Bermuda Triangle. the name stuck. It appears in headlines, in podcast descriptions, in YouTube video titles. And once a mystery has a catchy name, the mythology begins to grow. Stories about strange lights in the forest become linked to the disappearances, even if they occurred years apart. Local legends about the area's Native American history are folded into the narrative, even when no direct connection exists. The supernatural explanations gain traction, not because the evidence supports them, but because the absence of evidence creates a vacuum. It is a vacuum that folklore fills eagerly. Rivers himself has been absorbed into this mythology. He is no longer just a man who disappeared. He is the first victim of the Bennington Triangle, the opening chapter in a story that would eventually claim 5 people. But that framing obscures something important. When Rivers walked into the woods on November 12, 1945, there was no Bennington Triangle. There was no pattern. There was only a hunting trip that ended in a way no one expected. The pattern emerged later, in retrospect, after the other disappearances accumulated. And retrospection is not the same as causation. It is possible that the 5 disappearances are entirely unrelated, that each one had a different cause, an accident, a voluntary disappearance, a crime, that the geography is a coincidence, and the clustering is simply a byproduct of the area's remoteness and the limited historical record. It is equally possible that something about the terrain, or the culture, or the social conditions of the time made the region more prone to such events. The data does not allow a conclusion. This uncertainty is uncomfortable. Human minds prefer patterns. We want the 5 disappearances to mean something together, because a single unexplained event is easier to dismiss than a cluster of them. But the honest assessment is that we do not know. This uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it is honest. If you want to follow the file as we uncover the full pattern of the Bennington Triangle, stay on this case. In the comments, write "The file stays open" if you believe there is still an answer waiting in those woods. The case of Middie Rivers remains open. The Vermont State Police have not closed it, because there is no resolution to close. A 74-year-old man walked into the woods and was never seen again. His body was never found. The only trace was a cartridge that could have been dropped, or fired, or left for reasons no one will ever understand. There is no satisfying ending to this story. There is no moment of revelation. There is only the forest and the memory of a man who knew it better than anyone, and the fact that it swallowed him without a trace. That is the truth of it. That is the case. And it is why the Bennington Triangle is not a legend. It is a place where something happened that has not yet been explained. And the first person it happened to was a man who should have been safe.